Hello everyone, and welcome to the Stitchery. Today I released the long-awaited pattern for my Coffee Lovers sampler. Yep, it's technically still a sampler, and you'll see why. So this video is intended to assist anyone who has purchased that pattern in sewing it, or to make random viewers want to go buy the pattern. Either way works. I have been avoiding working on this piece for way too long, and I am so excited to finally release it because every time I've teased it on Instagram, there has been a great response. I personally prefer patterns that give guidance without demanding certain results, but I also understand that someone new to stitching may prefer to follow set instructions. So I've created this pattern to appeal to all different levels of stitchers and be easily adjustable to your own needs and desires. The first thing I'll note is that the pattern is modular, meaning each of these little squares is listed separately inside. That means you can adjust the final layout to reflect your own personality. If you want to just focus on your favorite coffee drinks in a 2x2 design, you can do that. If you like the full-size piece but not the order I arranged the coffees, rearrange to your heart's content. If you want to stitch each coffee separately and sew them into a quilt, totally doable. Also, I'd love to see that, so someone please do that. It's also important to me that my patterns be easy to sew with basic embroidery supplies. While I'll be stitching the full-size piece in a Q-snap frame during this video, I did sew another version before this using a regular round embroidery hoop, framing one square at a time until I finished the whole piece. So that is an easy option if you don't want to invest in new framing equipment. I've also laid out a specific color and stitch chart you can follow, which is what I'll be walking you through here, as well as suggestions for other ways to mix it up and make it your own. With all that said, let's get started on this pattern. The first thing you'll want to decide is how many and which of the squares you want to sew. For this video, I'll be using the pre-made layout I provided in the pattern, which prints out around 11 by 14 inches on 2 pieces of paper. Just print out the pattern in your desired size and start piecing your sections together. I'll just cut off the excess on my papers and tape them together in the center. If you're creating your own arrangement, you'll want to cut each square out, choose a layout, and then tape them together. Next, cut out your fabric to the proper size to fit the whole pattern. You'll want to use a non-stretch material that isn't too busy in pattern. If you want to use a darker fabric, make sure you can still see through it enough to trace your pattern, or you have the tracing supplies like transfer paper or fabric stabilizer that work better for dark fabrics. If you're using a smaller hoop to sew one square at a time, first measure out and draw a grid onto your fabric that lines up with your specific layout. This will allow you to trace each section onto the fabric in the proper place. If you have a hoop or a frame that will fit your entire pattern at once, frame your fabric and tighten it properly before tracing your pattern onto it. I use a light box to provide backlight and make it easier to trace my pattern, but you could also use a tablet or trace up against a window. If you are using a light colored fabric, you may not even need the extra light. Alternately, especially if you don't have access to a printer, you could start by tracing a grid onto the fabric you will be using, with each square in the grid the size you will want the squares of the pattern to be, then trace the pattern directly off of a tablet onto the fabric. I recommend using a heat erasable pen such as these Pilot friction pens, as they tend to have the finest points and allow you to get good detail. Always test your pen on the fabric you will be using first though, as these pens can sometimes leave behind ghost lines when you erase them. Let me pause here to note that I'm walking you through my typical process for transferring a pattern to fabric. There are many other methods and materials to use when transferring that other stitchers prefer. So if you typically use tracing paper or water-soluble paper, water-soluble pens, fabric stabilizer, or anything like that, then definitely stick to your preferred method. If you aren't able to follow my method here, or you just don't like it much, I highly recommend doing a bit of research on the other ways available. Everyone has their own preferences, and that's awesome. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to be sewing each element one at a time. So all of the espresso, then all of the coffee, etc. But I would normally sew one square in its entirety before moving on to the next square. So all of the espresso square, then all of the doppio, and so on. That's what you'll be doing if you're framing one square at a time in a regular embroidery hoop. Don't frame and reframe and keep moving back and forth across the piece. Frame one square, finish everything in it, and then move on to the next one. In this video, I'm just going to be showing you some brief walkthroughs of each stitch style that I'm going to be using, so I've linked the tutorials for each of these stitches in the description. You can check those out if you've never done them before. I'll also throw a few links up in the corner for the most popular fill stitches. I'm always going to be using 3 strands of DMC embroidery floss unless otherwise noted. Let's get started. I'm starting out with the lettering, both the titles and the ingredients, which I will be sewing with 310 black floss. I'm using 2 strands of floss for the titles and only 1 strand for the ingredients, since these are pretty small and detailed. Don't worry too much about getting the small lettering absolutely perfect. I tried making the lettering larger on the pattern and it just didn't look as good. So consider this font to be more like your handwriting and feel free to adjust the placement as needed. You'll be sick of the word espresso by the end of this piece. Sorry about that. If you find all of the lettering to be a little too much or too detailed or too small, never fear. You can always use a fabric pen to draw on the titles and ingredients instead of stitching it all. That would still look great and it would save you the stress of sewing all those tiny little letters. Okay, a little pause here to say, what? That's not how you spell affogato. When did this happen? The pattern I used had it spelled wrong too. Don't worry, I fixed that before releasing it to you guys. But the last version I stitched has it spelled right. I am very befuddled. And alas, I must now remove stitching, which I hate doing. But oh well, there we go. It's all fixed. Thank you so much to the person who is fluent in Italian and pointed this out to me. Moving on to the espresso sections, I'm going to be using brick stitch, sewn horizontally in 938, which is this lovely dark brown. The one exception is the lower section of the doppio cup, which I'm sewing vertically to contrast the second espresso section above it. Now you have 2 options when stitching horizontal brick stitch in a section with sloped sides like these cups. You can either expand the length of your stitches as you move up the cup into the larger area, which will give you these sort of diagonal lines between the stitches, or you can keep all of your stitches exactly the same size and add on more as you need to cover more space, which will give you straight vertical lines between the stitches. If you want to be really neat and specifically do one of those options, you can always draw on some lines before stitching each section to guide the placement of your stitches. Next up, let's fill in the coffee sections. I'm using 3031, a bit of a lighter brown, but still pretty dark. I'm going for a pretty realistic color palette on this one, but like I show in the pattern, you can get so creative with the colors. I've chosen to weave these sections, which means I'm laying down rows of straight stitches first. You can do vertical or horizontal ones, but I find it easiest to start with the vertical. Leave a little bit of space in between each so that you have room to weave in more stitches in the other direction. Once I start weaving in the other direction, I'm making sure to stack my rows pretty tightly together, using the needle to push them up so they're all even. Once you've woven the entire section, you'll want to add a border on any raw edges to cover up the ends. These sides will be covered by the outline of the cup, so I'm adding a single row of split stitch just to the top to finish it off. Okay, for the one water section here on the Americano, I'm using this very light blue, which is DMC 3756, and I wanted to do a fill stitch that is a bit holy since water itself is translucent. So I'm using what some people call a trellis stitch. I haven't personally put out a tutorial on this stitch, so I'll walk you through it a bit more here. Trellis is basically a detached blanket stitch that turns into a sort of net pattern. You'll want to start by outlining the entire section with an even-sized back stitch to create the anchor. Next, start in the upper left corner, coming up at the bottom of the first side back stitch. Then slide your needle under that first top back stitch from top to bottom, coming through on top of the loop your working thread creates. Pull gently so that your loop becomes just the size you want it to be, then move on to the next back stitch and slide your needle under the same way. Continue all the way to the end, then anchor that row by going through the fabric at the bottom of the first back stitch. You could then work the trellis back in the other direction, but I want mine to be super even, so I'm going back to the left side, coming up at the bottom of that second back stitch on the side outline, and continuing the pattern, this time sliding my needle under the loops I've created as the first row. When you get to the bottom of the section, which you can track by those side back stitches, you can whip stitch through the last row of loops to attach them to the bottom outline. Don't worry if your stitches are pulling up in the center as you go. Once you attach them to the bottom, they'll even out, and you can adjust them even more by rubbing your fingernail gently across them. Now on to the steamed milk. I'm using 3865, which is a lovely cream color, and I'll be stitching these sections with split stitch. Split stitch is amazing as a fill stitch. It has the greatest texture. You'll want to stitch it horizontally so that those raw ends will be covered by the cup outline, and the top ends up nice and smooth. Your rows may start tapering at the ends, so it's totally okay to throw in a few extra stitches here and there to keep them even and straight as you move up the section. Back in familiar territory, we are moving on to the cream section, which I am sewing with 712 in a stem stitch. I haven't used a ton of stem stitch on this piece, mainly because it takes a lot of thread and a lot of time to fill a section with stem. Just like with the split stitch, stem can start to slope or taper on the sides, so make sure you are evening out each row by adding extra stitches when necessary. The steamed half and half section I'll be sewing with ecru. Why this color gets a name instead of a number, I'm not sure. And I'm just going to be using satin stitch here because, I had to use regular satin stitch somewhere. For the milk section, I'm doing couching with 3865. Couching as a fill is such fun. I'll be using 4 strands of floss for the laid thread and only 2 for the tacking thread, and I'm going to work the couching in horizontally stacking lines. You could go vertically if you want, but those U-turns are the tricky part, and there's a lot less of them if you go horizontally. Make sure the tacking stitches in the center of the U-turn are perpendicular to your regular ones, so in this case, horizontal instead of vertical, in order to make it as small as possible. You can also play around with your tacking positions to add more texture. There are 2 sugar sections, regular sugar in Irish coffee and vanilla sugar in Raff coffee. So I'm using the same stitch for both sections, but different colors. First up, I'll use DMC 945. Since this section is a little bigger, I'm stitching seed the traditional way here, 2 small parallel straight stitches. I love the final look of a filled in seed stitch, but to be honest, I hate stitching it. My brain is constantly seeking patterns, so the random nature of a good seed stitch just does not agree with it. I'll be doing seed stitch in 437 for the sugar. And because it's a smaller section, I'm going rogue here and I'm doing only 1 straight stitch instead of the traditional double style. For the 2 syrups, chocolate and caramel, I'm again sharing stitch type with different colors. First up is chocolate, which I'll do in 801 using a blanket stitch. Now I'm getting into some more interesting fill stitches here that aren't always completely solid. So if you prefer to fill these areas with something that you won't be able to see through at all, feel free to switch these out for more satin or stem stitch. I'm stitching the blanket pretty close together so the gaps aren't too big, and you could definitely go even tighter than this, but I like that final look. Over to the caramel section, I'm using more blanket stitch in 3826. Since the bottom of these sections will be covered up by the cup outline, I'm doing the blanket stitch upward with the solid line on top. I also always go back to the beginning once I'm done and add a straight stitch to close that very first blanket stitch. On to the Irish whiskey. I'm getting creative here again, especially since there's just the 1 small section. I'm stitching a raised chain stitch in 975. Now you could definitely get full coverage out of raised chain, as I show in the tutorial for it on my chain stitch sampler, but I went with only 2 rows of chain across the ladder, which leaves a few holes. For no holes at all, try adding 3 rows of chain to the ladder instead. Okay, I know we've already done satin stitch, but for the whipped cream, we're going to do a sort of more specific satin stitch, angled into rows to show the separate dollops. I'm using B5200 for this, which is just good old white floss. You can start out by drawing on some diagonal lines to guide where your stitches will go, or just freehand it and hope for the best. Just make sure the top section is angled towards the little peak in order to stitch it as easily as possible. On to the ice cream, which will be rope stitch in B5200. This one was a long shot, and honestly, I'm not thrilled with the results, though they are growing on me. If you don't want to get crazy with the experimentation, I would recommend going back to the angled satin stitch we just used on the whipped cream to make this look best, or even try filling each little section separately with stem stitch. But hey, if you want to give rope stitch a go, you can probably make it look better than I did. I alternated the directions I was stitching the rope on each layer, originally intending to angle them like I did with the satin stitch. They did not want to be angled though, so the switching is more about where the little bulb on the top lands. I ended up with this sort of 3D curving on each section, and that's what I'm actually starting to really like. For the last section before we add those cups, it's milk foam time. I'm stitching the foam in 3865 with French knots because yes, we had to do knots, and honestly, what better place to use them than the texture of milk foam? It was too perfect to resist. I'm mostly using 2 wrapped French knots for this, but throwing a few 3 wrap knots in to give the texture a bit of variety. If your brain likes to make patterns like mine does, you'll find yourself automatically sewing rows of knots, which is fine, but might end up looking a little too placed. Squish a few knots together, or do a few larger or smaller ones here and there to break up the perfect rows and give it a more scattered appearance. Finally, we will finish up this piece by stitching the outline of the cups with any bright, fun color you want. You could even do every single cup in a different color, like the example I showed in the pattern. I'm going to be using this lovely green color, DMC 991, and using a good old go-to stitch, chain stitch. I used chain for the outside of the cups the first time I sewed this piece, and it was lovely, so even though I switched up most of the other stitches, this one had to stay. For the handles, you can sew multiple rows of chain to fill them up. It generally took me 4 rows to fill the big coffee cup handles and 3 rows to fill the espresso cup handles. And that's it. All that's left for you to do is iron out your wrinkles, sticky off any clingy pet fur, and frame this baby for all to see. I chose to frame mine using the canvas style, which I have a tutorial for. I will link that in the corner and the description, but there are so many ways you could use this finished piece. Put it in a hoop, stitch it on a pillow front, make a purse, get creative. Plus, you can always split up this design into its modular parts, then put it in several hoops, on napkins or kitchen towels, on a t-shirt or the back pocket of a pair of jeans. The options are seemingly limitless, and I cannot wait to see what you're able to create. So make sure to tag me on Instagram at GetTheeToTheStitchery so I can see and share your finished pieces. If you don't have this pattern yet, head over to my Etsy shop using the link in the description to pick up a PDF and start stitching. As always, I appreciate each and every one of you, and I'm so grateful to have a platform to share the joys of embroidery with so many people. Happy stitching to you all, and I will see you back here at the Stitchery for another tutorial soon.